Walter Mercer placed the divorce papers on the small hospital table, as if he were setting down a receipt. Around them, the rehabilitation room fell silent. A doctor paused mid-sentence. A nurse stopped adjusting the straps on the wheelchair. Across from him, Gabrielle Donovan sat, motionless, her legs still braced from the accident that had shattered her spine. Walter didn't lower his voice. "I can't spend my life taking care of someone who will never walk again." The words hung in the sterile air. He turned and walked out, leaving his disabled wife in front of witnesses who would remember that moment for years. Walter Mercer believed he had just freed himself from a burden. What he didn't know was that the quiet woman he had abandoned owned a jewelry empire worth $500 million. Before we step into the rest of this story, take a moment to tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. Stories like this travel across cities and countries, and it's always fascinating to see how far they reach. And if you believe that dignity and truth always find their way back to the surface, consider subscribing so you won't miss the rest of Gabrielle Donovan's story. A year before the accident, Gabrielle Donovan lived a life that most people would have described as quiet, even ordinary. Their townhouse stood on a narrow street in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where rows of brick homes faced sidewalks shaded by old maple trees. In the early mornings, the neighborhood smelled faintly of roasted coffee, drifting from the corner cafe 2 blocks away. Commuters hurried past with paper cups in their hands, and the world moved at the steady rhythm of professionals, beginning another weekday. Inside the townhouse, Gabrielle usually woke before Walter. She moved quietly through the kitchen, her dark hair tied loosely behind her neck, a notebook already resting on the small wooden table near the window. She rarely turned on the television. Instead, she listened to the faint sounds of the street waking up while she wrote in careful, neat lines. Lists, observations, ideas for designs. Occasionally, a sentence that looked more like a thought than a note. Walter Mercer, on the other hand, woke to alarms. Sometimes 2 of them. His mornings were louder, faster, and filled with the small frustrations of someone already running behind schedule. Drawers opened and shut. The coffee machine hissed. The bathroom door closed with more force than necessary. Walter worked as a senior sales agent at a mid-sized real estate brokerage in downtown Boston. It was the kind of job that required confidence charm and a constant effort to appear successful. He understood one thing very clearly: perception mattered. Walter liked expensive suits even when the commission checks were late. He liked telling stories about deals that almost closed. He liked being seen in restaurants where the lighting was low and the wine lists were long. And over time, he had begun to believe that Gabrielle didn't quite fit into that image. To Walter's colleagues, Gabrielle was difficult to explain. At company gatherings, she spoke politely, but rarely joined long conversations. She listened more than she talked. If someone asked what she did for work, she usually gave a simple answer: "I design jewelry." The explanation sounded small. Freelance designers were common enough in a city like Boston. A few handmade pieces here, custom work there. The sort of creative work that paid bills but rarely made headlines. Walter had repeated that description many times. "My wife's a designer," he would say casually to clients or co-workers. "She works from home." There was always a slight shrug when he said it. Not dismissive exactly, but close. At home, Gabrielle spent hours in the small studio room upstairs. Sunlight poured through the tall window above her desk, illuminating trays of gemstones, thin metal tools, and pages filled with precise sketches. She worked slowly, every line measured, every curve deliberate. When Walter occasionally stepped into the room, he saw pieces of metal stones no larger than raindrops and designs that looked intricate but incomplete. He never asked many questions. To him, it looked like a hobby that had turned into a modest career. What Walter never understood was that Gabrielle had been trained to observe the smallest details long before she had ever drawn her first design. Her father had taught her that. Arthur Donovan had built Donovan and Pierce into one of the most respected luxury jewelry houses in the United States. The company rarely advertised and almost never sought publicity. Its reputation spread through private collectors, international exhibitions, and a network of clients who valued discretion above attention. Arthur believed two things mattered more than brilliance or ambition: patience and memory. When Gabrielle was 16, he had given her a simple instruction during a quiet afternoon in the workshop. "People reveal themselves when they believe no one is watching," he told her. He had handed her a small leather notebook. "Write it down." Gabrielle had never stopped. Years later, that habit remained with her everywhere she went. In cafes, on airplanes, at dinner tables, even in the quiet mornings of the Cambridge townhouse. Walter never noticed how often she wrote, or how carefully. In the evenings, their lives moved in parallel, more than together. Walter often came home late, energized by conversations from the office or irritated by deals that had slipped away. He talked about clients who couldn't decide, investors who changed their minds, and colleagues who closed contracts he believed he deserved. Gabrielle listened. Sometimes she asked a question. Most of the time she simply watched the way Walter spoke, the rhythm of his voice, the small pauses when he exaggerated a detail, the moments when frustration slipped into his words. She never corrected him. She never argued. She wrote things down later. To Walter, the marriage felt stable, predictable, comfortable enough. He had never considered the possibility that the quiet woman sitting across from him at dinner carried a history that stretched far beyond their townhouse walls. Donovan and Pierce had been founded nearly 70 years earlier by Gabrielle's grandfather and his business partner, Leonard Pierce. The company began as a small workshop in Manhattan's Diamond District. Over decades, it grew into a global brand known among collectors and luxury houses for pieces that combined traditional craftsmanship with modern design. Private auctions, royal collections, museum exhibitions. Donovan and Pierce jewels had traveled farther than most people ever would, and after Arthur Donovan passed away 3 years earlier, control of the company had quietly transferred to his only child, Gabrielle Donovan. Her name did not appear in magazines. It did not appear in press releases, but inside the company's legal structure, there was no ambiguity. Gabrielle owned the majority of the shares, $500 million in assets, factories, design studios, international distribution networks, all of it connected to a name that Walter Mercer had never once searched for, because Gabrielle had never told him. Some people might have called that secrecy. For Gabrielle, it was something simpler. She wanted to know who Walter Mercer was without the influence of money, without the gravity of power, without the weight of inheritance, bending every interaction around him. And for several years, the answer had seemed reassuring. Walter was ambitious, sometimes impatient, occasionally careless with his words. But he had appeared loyal. He had appeared kind enough. Life rarely reveals its most important truths in comfortable moments. The revelation usually arrives in a single, unexpected fracture, on a rainy night, on a highway slick with water, in the sudden loss of control that separates one life from another. 1 year later, that fracture would arrive on the Massachusetts Turnpike, and everything Walter Mercer believed about his marriage would begin to change. The night of the accident began with laughter-polished glass and the quiet tension of people trying to impress one another. Walter Mercer stood near the bar of the downtown Boston restaurant, his tie slightly loosened, a half-finished drink in his hand. The brokerage had reserved the entire back room for a client appreciation event. Real estate investors, developers, and a few carefully selected guests filled the space with low conversations and occasional bursts of laughter. To Walter, evenings like this were opportunities, not just social gatherings, opportunities. Every conversation could become a sale, every handshake could lead to a contract, and every appearance mattered. Gabrielle Donovan stood beside him, dressed simply in a dark blue dress that caught the light when she moved. She had agreed to attend the event only after Walter insisted several times that her presence would help. "You don't even have to talk much," he had told her that afternoon. "Just being there helps." Gabrielle had nodded. She understood what he meant. To Walter, a wife was part of the presentation, a quiet signal that his life was stable, respectable, successful. Throughout the evening, Gabrielle did exactly what she always did in unfamiliar social circles. She observed. Walter moved from group to group with practiced confidence. His smile came easily, his voice slightly louder than the room required. He described properties with enthusiasm and spoke about the Boston market as if he had personally designed it. A few times he gestured toward Gabrielle. "My wife, Gabrielle. She designs jewelry." The introductions were brief, polite, forgettable. One of the investors, a gray-haired man named Thomas Reed, seemed mildly curious. "Jewelry design?" he asked. "Custom pieces?" Gabrielle nodded. "Mostly." Reed smiled politely, before turning his attention back to Walter and the subject of commercial properties near the harbor. It was the same pattern she had seen many times. The conversation always moved on. Near the end of the evening, Walter accepted another drink from a colleague, then another. Gabrielle noticed the change gradually. His voice grew louder, his stories longer. The small precision he normally maintained in business conversations began to blur. By the time the event ended, rain had begun falling across Boston. Not a gentle drizzle, a steady, relentless rain that coated the streets in reflective black glass. Walter waved goodbye to the last group of guests and reached for his coat. "You ready?" he asked. Gabrielle nodded. The walk to the parking garage was short but cold. Rain tapped against the concrete structure as they reached Walter's car, a dark sedan he had purchased the previous year after closing a particularly profitable deal. Walter slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. Gabrielle fastened her seatbelt. The windshield wipers began their steady rhythm as they pulled onto the street. For the first few minutes, neither of them spoke. Traffic moved slowly through downtown Boston, headlights reflecting across the wet pavement. The city lights blurred into long streaks of gold and white against the rain. Eventually, Walter broke the silence. "You could have talked more tonight," he said casually. Gabrielle looked out the window. People seemed more interested in the properties. "That's not the point." Walter's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "It helps when clients see a complete picture. A complete picture. You know what I mean." Gabrielle waited. Walter glanced at her briefly before returning his eyes to the road. A successful guy, stable life, supportive wife. His tone wasn't angry, but there was frustration beneath it. "You barely said anything," he added. "I answered when people asked questions." Walter exhaled through his nose. "You don't understand how these things work." Gabrielle turned her head slightly. "How do they work?" Walter shifted in his seat, the alcohol softening his usual restraint. "These investors expect a certain image. When they see someone quiet, someone who doesn't really participate, it sends the wrong message." The car merged onto the Massachusetts Turnpike. Rain struck the windshield harder now, the sound louder inside the car. "What message?" Gabrielle asked calmly. Walter hesitated. Then he said it. "That maybe I married someone without ambition." The words lingered in the air between them. Gabrielle didn't respond immediately. Outside, the highway stretched forward in a ribbon of wet asphalt illuminated by headlights and taillights. "Ambition means different things to different people," she said finally. Walter gave a small laugh. "That's exactly what I mean." He accelerated slightly as the traffic thinned. "You design jewelry from home, Gabrielle. That's fine, but it's not exactly a powerhouse career." She watched the road ahead. Walter continued speaking, the alcohol loosening the filter between thought and voice. If you actually leaned into it, maybe used some connections, maybe built a brand, who knows? But you're comfortable staying small. Gabrielle folded her hands in her lap. You've never asked about my work. Walter waved one hand dismissively before placing it back on the wheel. Because I know what it is. Rain intensified. The wipers moved faster now, but visibility still dropped as sheets of water crossed the windshield. You sketch designs, Walter said. You sell a few pieces. That's great. But it's not exactly the kind of thing that builds a future. Gabrielle's voice remained steady. And what kind of future are you building? Walter smirked slightly. A real one. The highway curved gently ahead. Walter leaned forward slightly, peering through the rain. I'm talking about serious money, he continued. Real estate deals, investments, not handcrafted necklaces. For a moment, the car filled only with the sound of rain and tires cutting through water. Then Gabrielle spoke quietly. You seem very certain about what matters. Walter didn't notice the subtle shift in her tone. Because I've seen how the world works, he said. Money changes everything. A truck passed them in the next lane, sending a wave of water across the windshield. Walter blinked. The wipers struggled for a second to clear the glass. For a brief moment, the road ahead disappeared behind a wall of rain. Walter instinctively tapped the brakes. The tires lost traction. The car slid. At first, it was only a slight drift across the slick pavement. Then the rear wheels spun. Walter grabbed the steering wheel harder, trying to correct the motion. But the vehicle had already begun to spin sideways across the highway. Headlights from another car appeared suddenly through the rain. Bright. Too close. Gabrielle's hand instinctively braced against the dashboard. Walter's voice rose sharply. Hold on! The impact came with a violent explosion of metal and glass. The world flipped. The car rolled once, then again, before crashing onto its side against the guardrail. Rain continued falling. Inside the twisted vehicle, silence settled slowly over the wreckage. Walter's head throbbed as he opened his eyes. Airbags hung deflated around him. The smell of gasoline and wet asphalt filled the air. He groaned, disoriented but conscious. Gabrielle. No answer. He turned his head. Gabrielle hung sideways in her seatbelt, motionless. Rain dripped through the cracked windshield. In the distance, sirens began to rise. And although Walter Mercer didn't know it yet, the life he believed he controlled had just shifted onto a path he would never be able to undo. The hospital lights were brighter than daylight. Walter Mercer noticed that immediately when the ambulance doors opened and the paramedics rushed Gabrielle Donovan through the emergency entrance of Massachusetts General Hospital. The white fluorescent glow washed the color from everything: faces, clothing, even the streaks of rain still clinging to Walter's jacket. The world moved quickly around him. Doctors spoke in clipped, efficient sentences. Nurses rolled equipment beside the gurney. A paramedic explained details of the crash while walking beside them. Female, early 30s. Possible spinal trauma. Conscious for a few seconds at the scene, then unresponsive. Walter followed until the swinging doors of the trauma unit closed in front of him. Then he stopped. For the first time since the accident, silence surrounded him. His hands trembled slightly as he looked down at them. A small cut ran along his knuckle. His shoulder ached where the seatbelt had locked during the crash, but otherwise he was almost untouched. A nurse approached him. "Sir, we need you to wait here while the doctors examine her." Walter nodded automatically. He sat in a plastic chair in the hallway, the cold surface pressing through his damp clothes. The smell of antiseptic and cleaning solution hung in the air. Minutes passed, or perhaps an hour. Time inside hospitals had a strange way of stretching and folding at the same time. Walter stared at the floor tiles while fragments of the night replayed in his mind: the rain, the sudden loss of control, the violent spin of the car. Eventually, a doctor stepped through the trauma doors. Dr. Ethan Caldwell was a tall man in his late 40s, his voice calm in the way of someone accustomed to delivering difficult information. Mr. Mercer Walter stood immediately. "Yes, how is she?" The doctor hesitated briefly, measuring his words. "Your wife is stable. She's conscious now." Walter exhaled, but Dr. Caldwell continued. "She sustained a severe injury to her spine during the crash. The hallway felt colder." "What does that mean?" Walter asked. "It means the vertebrae in her lower back suffered significant damage." Walter swallowed. "Will she recover?" The doctor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward a small consultation room nearby. "Let's sit down." Inside the room, the lighting was softer but no less serious. A medical chart rested in Dr. Caldwell's hands. "We've completed the initial scans," he said carefully. "Right now it appears the spinal cord has been compressed." Walter leaned forward. "So you can fix it, right? There will be surgery, rehabilitation, possibly multiple procedures." The doctor's voice remained steady. "But spinal injuries are complex. Recovery can take years." Walter stared at him, and walking Dr. Caldwell's expression did not change. "We don't know yet." The words hung in the quiet room. "We'll do everything possible," the doctor added, "but it's important to understand that mobility may be limited for a significant period of time." Walter nodded slowly, but the look in his eyes had already begun to change. Across the hospital floor, Gabrielle Donovan lay in a private room surrounded by machines that hummed softly through the night. Her back was braced in place. Sensors monitored her heart rate. The dull ache in her body pulsed in waves, but her mind remained clear. Pain had a strange ability to sharpen awareness. When Dr. Caldwell entered the room later that night, Gabrielle watched his expression carefully. Doctors revealed more through silence than through words. He explained the injury calmly, the surgery that would come in the morning, the uncertainty that followed. Gabrielle listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked only one question. "How long will rehabilitation take?" "Possibly several years," he answered. Gabrielle nodded once. "Thank you for being honest." The doctor seemed slightly surprised by the simplicity of her response. Many patients reacted with fear, or anger, or disbelief. Gabrielle only asked for a notebook. A nurse returned a few minutes later with a small hospital notepad and a pen. Even with the stiffness in her hands, Gabrielle began writing. Date, time, Dr. Ethan Caldwell. Diagnosis summary. Estimated recovery timeline. The handwriting was slower than usual, but still precise. When Walter entered the room later that night, Gabrielle looked up from the page. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Walter approached the bed, slowly. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Tired." That was the truth. He looked at the medical equipment around her. "So, they explained everything." "Yes." Walter shifted his weight. "They're going to operate tomorrow," he said. Gabrielle nodded. Silence returned. Walter glanced toward the window where rain still streaked faintly across the glass. "This is going to be a long road," he said. Gabrielle studied his face. "Yes." He ran a hand through his hair. "They said recovery could take years." "Yes." Walter forced a small smile. "Well, we'll deal with it." But the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Gabrielle noticed that. And because she noticed, she wrote something new in the notebook after Walter stepped briefly into the hallway to take a phone call. 11:48 p.m. Walter sounded uncertain. The next morning, the surgery lasted nearly 5 hours. Walter waited again in the same plastic chairs outside the operating room. This time the hallway felt even longer. When Dr. Caldwell finally returned, his voice carried cautious optimism. "The procedure went as planned," he said. "We were able to stabilize the vertebrae." Walter nodded quickly. So she'll be fine. Dr. Caldwell did not confirm that. The surgery was only the first step. Recovery will depend heavily on rehabilitation. Walter's shoulders stiffened slightly. How long? Months at minimum, possibly years. Later that afternoon, Gabrielle regained consciousness. The room was quiet except for the steady rhythm of medical monitors. Walter stood near the foot of the bed when her eyes opened. For a brief moment, relief crossed his face. "You're awake." Gabrielle's voice was soft. "Yes." She shifted slightly, or tried to. Her legs did not respond. The realization passed silently across her expression. She did not panic. She did not cry. Instead, she looked toward the notebook resting on the small table beside her bed. Walter followed her gaze and handed it to her. Gabrielle wrote slowly, "Surgery complete, mobility unknown." Walter watched the words appear on the page. "You don't have to write everything down," he said. Gabrielle looked at him. "It helps." Walter nodded. But as the days passed, the hospital room began to reveal something more complicated than injury. At first, Walter stayed most of the day. He answered messages from work. He spoke with doctors. He brought coffee and occasionally flowers. But by the end of the first week, small changes appeared. Phone calls grew longer. Visits grew shorter. Work, he explained. Clients needed attention. Deals could not wait. Gabrielle listened, and she continued writing. Conversations, dates, small shifts in tone. Because Gabrielle Donovan had learned something long ago from her father. When people begin to feel trapped by circumstances, they reveal parts of themselves they once kept hidden. And Walter Mercer was beginning to feel very trapped. The second week after the surgery brought a different kind of quiet to Gabrielle Donovan's hospital room. The machines still hummed softly. Nurses still checked her vitals every few hours. The physical therapy team had already begun introducing small exercises designed to stimulate nerve response. But something else had changed. Walter Mercer was no longer there every morning. At first, the absence seemed reasonable. Work, he explained during a brief visit one afternoon. His brokerage had several deals moving at once and clients expected quick responses. Real estate did not pause simply because life had taken an unexpected turn. Gabrielle listened. She nodded. She said she understood, and she wrote down the time he left. The notebook had already begun filling with careful entries. Dates, names, fragments of conversations. Not accusations, not judgments, just records. Tuesday, 10:15 a.m., Walter visit. Stayed 12 minutes. Wednesday, phone call. Said he was meeting a client. Friday, no visit. The entries were small, almost mundane. But Gabrielle's father had always said that patterns revealed more truth than single moments. On a gray afternoon near the end of that week, Gabrielle sat upright in bed while a physical therapist adjusted the braces around her legs. The therapist, a young woman named Rebecca Lawson, spoke with the steady encouragement of someone who had guided many patients through similar recoveries. "We're going to focus on upper body strength first," Rebecca explained. "Your arms and shoulders will help support movement later." Gabrielle followed each instruction carefully. Lift, hold, release. The exercises were exhausting, even though they appeared simple. When the session ended, Rebecca offered a reassuring smile. "You're doing very well for this stage." "Thank you," Gabrielle said. After the therapist left, Gabrielle reached for her notebook. 11:30 a.m. physical therapy session. Progress minimal but stable. She paused before adding another line. Walter, absent again. Later that evening, Walter finally arrived. He entered the room with the slightly hurried energy of someone who had squeezed the visit between other obligations. "Hey," he said, placing his phone on the small table beside the bed. Gabrielle looked up from her notebook. "Hi." Walter glanced briefly at the physical therapy equipment stacked near the wall. So they've already started all that? Yes. How long was the session? About 40 minutes. Walter nodded. Good, he said, though the word carried little weight. He sat down in the chair beside the bed but immediately checked his phone again. A message flashed across the screen and his fingers moved quickly as he typed a response. Gabrielle watched him for a moment. Then she wrote another entry. 6:48 p.m. Walter, distracted during visit. Walter noticed the movement of her pen. You still writing everything down? He asked. Yes. Why? Gabrielle considered the question. It helps me keep track of things. Walter shrugged slightly. Well, you're going to have a lot of things to track if this recovery really takes years. The word years hung between them. Gabrielle did not respond immediately. Instead, she closed the notebook gently. How was work today? She asked. Walter leaned back in the chair. Busy. Good busy. He hesitated. Complicated, busy. Gabrielle waited. Walter rubbed the back of his neck. There's a development project near Back Bay that might close next month. Big deal. But the investors are hesitant right now. Why? Walter gave a short laugh. Because people don't like uncertainty. The words seemed to surprise even him as they left his mouth. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Walter stood up. I should probably get going soon, he said. You just arrived. I know, but I've got an early meeting tomorrow. Gabrielle nodded once. Of course. Walter picked up his coat. I'll come by this weekend, he added quickly. Okay. But when the weekend arrived, Walter did not appear. Instead, Gabrielle received a phone call late Saturday afternoon. Hey, Walter said through the phone. His voice carried the faint background noise of a crowded room. Are you at work? Gabrielle asked. Yeah, sort of. Meeting with a client. The music behind him suggested something closer to a restaurant than an office. I might not make it to the hospital today, he continued. That's all right. Things are just complicated right now. Gabrielle listened quietly. Then she heard another voice in the background. Male, familiar. Ryan Whitaker. Ryan had been Walter's closest friend since college and now worked at the same brokerage. His voice carried clearly through the phone for a brief moment. Tell her the truth, man. You're not built for this. Walter moved the phone away slightly. Hold on, he said. The sound became muffled as he spoke to Ryan somewhere outside Gabrielle's hearing. But when he returned to the call, his tone had shifted. I'll try to come tomorrow, he said. Okay. After the call ended, Gabrielle stared at the silent phone for several seconds. Then she reached for the notebook again. Saturday, 4:22 p.m. phone call, Ryan Whitaker present. She hesitated before writing the final line. Ryan, you're not built for this. Gabrielle closed the notebook slowly. Across the city inside a crowded bar near the brokerage office. Walter Mercer sat with Ryan Whitaker at a corner table. Ryan lifted his glass. You look like someone just handed you a life sentence, he said. Walter stared down at the table. This wasn't supposed to happen. Ryan shrugged. Accidents don't ask permission. Walter exhaled heavily. They're saying she might not walk again. Ryan leaned back, and Walter looked up, frustration surfacing in his voice. And that means everything changes. Ryan watched him carefully. Yeah, he said slowly. It does. Walter rubbed his temples. I had plans, Ryan. So I didn't plan to spend the next 10 years taking care of someone. Ryan did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied his friend with the detached honesty that only long friendships allowed. You sound like you already made a decision. Walter's voice lowered. I don't know if I can do this. Ryan nodded slowly. That's the truth you didn't want to say out loud. Walter looked away. Across the bar, laughter erupted from another table. Life moved forward around them without hesitation. Ryan leaned forward slightly. "You need to think about your future," he said. Walter nodded, but neither of them realized that somewhere across the city, Gabrielle Donovan had already written down the exact moment that future began to change. 3 weeks after the accident, the hospital had begun to settle into a rhythm that felt almost routine. Mornings started with quiet examinations. Nurses checked vital signs. Physical therapists guided Gabrielle Donovan through exercises that left her arms trembling with effort. The long hallway outside her room filled with the soft sounds of rolling carts and distant conversations. Recovery, she had learned, was not dramatic. It was slow, measured in inches rather than miles. And during those weeks, Gabrielle continued doing the one thing she had always done best. She watched. Walter Mercer visited less often now. The pattern was clear enough that it no longer surprised the nurses on the floor. At first, he had come every day, then every other day. Now sometimes several days passed before he appeared. When he did visit, the conversations were shorter, more practical, less personal. Gabrielle wrote it all down, not because she expected to use the information one day, but because recording the truth had always been her way of understanding it. On a quiet Thursday morning, Dr. Ethan Caldwell entered her room carrying a thin folder of updated scans. "Good morning, Gabrielle," he said. "Good morning, doctor." He reviewed the chart for a moment before looking up. "Your recovery is progressing within expectations. That's good news." Gabrielle listened carefully, but she asked. Dr. Caldwell gave a small smile. "You're perceptive." He pulled a chair closer to the bed. The spinal cord injury was severe. Physical therapy will continue to be essential. There is still a possibility of significant improvement. Gabrielle nodded. And the possibility of no improvement. The doctor did not contradict her. Yes. The honesty in the room was calm, rather than frightening. Gabrielle appreciated that. "What happens next?" she asked. "We'll begin preparing for your transfer to a long-term rehabilitation center in about 2 weeks. Gabriel wrote the information down as he spoke. Transfer timeline, rehabilitation phase, estimated recovery period. Dr. Caldwell watched the steady movement of her pen. "You handle this with remarkable composure," he said. Gabriel paused. "My father taught me that panic rarely improves outcomes." The doctor smiled faintly. "A useful lesson." Later that afternoon, Walter arrived unexpectedly. He stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside the room. "Hey," he said. Gabrielle looked up from her notebook. "Hello." Walter noticed immediately that the physical therapy equipment had increased. Resistance bands hung from a metal frame beside the bed. A wheelchair waited near the window. "You're already using that?" he asked, gesturing toward the chair. "Sometimes," Gabrielle said. "The therapists are helping me build upper body strength." Walter nodded slowly. "That's good." He sat down in the chair beside the bed, but the tension in his posture was noticeable. Gabrielle studied him quietly. "You seem tired," she said. Walter rubbed his eyes briefly. "Work's been crazy. Busy. More like complicated." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I've been trying to keep everything together at the office, but deals are slipping through. Clients don't like waiting." Gabrielle listened. "You're under pressure." Walter laughed once, but it sounded hollow. "You have no idea." Silence followed. The hospital room seemed smaller than usual. Walter stared at the floor for a moment before speaking again. "They told you how long this recovery could take." "Right, yes. And you understand that things are going to be different." Gabrielle did not respond immediately. Instead, she waited. Walter stood up and began pacing slowly near the window. "I've been thinking about the future," he said. "About how everything changes." Gabrielle watched him carefully. How so? Walter stopped walking. Well, for one thing, you won't be able to work the way you used to. I can still design, maybe, Walter said quickly. But realistically, that kind of work takes mobility. Shows, meetings, travel. Gabrielle noticed how quickly he spoke, as if convincing himself. And there's the house, Walter continued. The stairs alone make it impossible. There are solutions for that. Walter shook his head. You're missing the bigger picture. Gabrielle closed her notebook slowly. Then explain it to me. Walter exhaled. The bigger picture is that my life is changing too. His voice had grown firmer now. I didn't plan for this. No one plans for accidents, Gabrielle said. Walter ran a hand through his hair. That's exactly my point. The tension in the room deepened. Gabrielle waited. Walter looked at her directly now. I'm 36 years old, he said. My career is finally starting to take off. I'm working 80-hour weeks trying to stay competitive. Gabrielle said nothing, and now everything revolves around hospital visits, rehabilitation schedules, long-term care plans. His voice hardened slightly. That's not the life I built. The sentence hung in the air. Gabrielle's expression remained calm. Life changes, she said quietly. Walter shook his head. Not like this. The silence that followed was heavy but controlled. Neither of them raised their voice. Neither of them moved. Finally, Walter reached into his briefcase. He placed a thin folder on the small hospital table beside her bed. Gabrielle looked down at it. What is it? Walter's voice was steady. Paperwork. Gabrielle opened the folder slowly. Inside were several neatly arranged documents. Legal documents. Divorce papers. Walter spoke before she could finish reading. I talked to a lawyer this week. Gabrielle looked up at him. I can't do this, he said. You can't do what? Walter gestured toward the wheelchair, the hospital bed, the room itself. I can't spend the rest of my life being a caretaker. His voice was no longer defensive. It was simply final. This accident changed everything. Gabrielle studied his face for several seconds. The decision had already been made, long before this conversation. Walter continued speaking. It's not fair to either of us to pretend otherwise. He tapped the documents lightly. If you sign those, we can finalize everything quickly. Gabrielle turned another page. The legal language was clear, irreversible. Outside the room, a nurse passed quietly down the hallway. Inside, time seemed to pause. Finally, Gabrielle closed the folder. You've already decided, she said. Walter nodded. Yes. Then why ask me? Because we have to make it official. Gabrielle looked down at the documents again. Then she reached for the pen resting beside her notebook. Walter seemed slightly surprised by the speed of her movement. You're not going to argue, no. You're not angry. Gabrielle met his eyes. No. She signed the final page with a steady hand. Walter watched the pen move across the paper. When she finished, she placed the documents back inside the folder and slid it toward him. Walter picked it up slowly. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his expression. Then he cleared his throat. I think this is the best decision for both of us. Gabrielle said nothing. Walter moved toward the door. I'll have my lawyer contact you about the rest. He paused briefly before leaving. Take care of yourself, Gabrielle. The door closed softly behind him. The room returned to its quiet rhythm. Gabrielle sat motionless for a long moment. Then she reached for her phone. Her fingers moved calmly across the screen. She opened a contact she had not used in nearly a year. Charlotte Pierce, Chief Executive Officer, Donovan and Pierce. Gabrielle typed a single message. Charlotte. It's time. She pressed send. And somewhere in a high-rise office in Manhattan, a phone buzzed on a glass conference table. At 7:14 a.m. the following morning, Charlotte Pierce was already in her office, on the 32nd floor of Donovan and Pierce's Manhattan headquarters. The building stood quietly on Madison Avenue, its glass facade reflecting the pale morning light of early autumn. Inside, the offices were still mostly empty. Assistants would arrive soon. Designers would fill the studios upstairs. Conference rooms would slowly come alive with meetings about gemstone suppliers and the coming winter collection. But Charlotte Pierce preferred the silence of early hours. She sat at the long conference table reviewing production reports when her phone vibrated softly beside her coffee cup. The screen lit up. Gabrielle Donovan. Charlotte's hand froze for a fraction of a second. The message contained only 3 words. Charlotte. It's time. For anyone else, the words would have meant nothing. For Charlotte Pierce, they meant everything. She leaned back in her chair reading the message again, even though there was nothing more to interpret. For nearly a year, Gabrielle Donovan had stepped away from active involvement in Donovan and Pierce's operations. Officially, Charlotte served as acting CEO, while Gabrielle focused on personal matters. Unofficially, everyone on the executive board understood the truth. Gabrielle Donovan was the controlling owner of the company that had grown from a modest Manhattan workshop into a global luxury brand valued at over $500 million. And when Gabrielle said it was time, the meaning was unmistakable. Charlotte pressed a button on the conference phone. "Emily," she said to her assistant through the line. "Yes, Ms. Pierce, please contact the executive board. I want an emergency meeting scheduled for 10 o'clock. There was a pause. "Is something wrong?" Charlotte looked again at the message on her screen. "No," she said calmly. "Something is about to change." 200 miles north in Boston, Gabrielle Donovan sat in the hospital bed near the window watching the morning sunlight slowly spread across the floor. The city moved normally outside. Cars filled the streets. Pedestrians hurried toward work. Life continued without hesitation. Inside the room, the quiet remained undisturbed except for the faint mechanical rhythm of medical equipment. Gabrielle had already finished her morning therapy session. Her shoulders ached from the effort, but the pain felt almost welcome. Pain meant progress. On the small tray beside her bed lay the same leather notebook she had carried for years. The newest entry sat beneath the previous night's final note. 6:42 p.m. Walter delivered divorce documents. Beneath it, she had written a second line. 7:02 p.m. Documents signed. Gabrielle did not add commentary. Facts were enough. A few minutes later, her phone vibrated. Charlotte Pierce. Gabrielle answered immediately. "Good morning, Charlotte." Charlotte's voice came through steady, though there was an unmistakable shift in its tone. "I received your message." "Yes. I assume this means you're ready to re-engage with the company." "Yes." Charlotte hesitated. "Are you certain?" Gabrielle looked out the window again. "I'm certain." Charlotte exhaled slowly. "The board will want to know the details. They don't need details yet." "What do they need?" Gabrielle paused for a moment before answering. "They need patience." Charlotte smiled faintly. "That sounds like your father." Gabrielle said nothing. Arthur Donovan had been a careful strategist. Every major decision he made had unfolded slowly, often over months, sometimes years. Gabrielle had inherited that same patience. Charlotte spoke again. "We've kept everything exactly as you instructed. The ownership structure hasn't changed. Your controlling shares remain untouched. Good. The board still believes you'll return eventually." "I will." Charlotte leaned forward slightly in her chair. "What do you need from us?" Gabrielle looked down at the notebook beside her. "First, silence. That's already in place. Second, legal preparation." Charlotte's tone sharpened slightly. "For what purpose?" "Documentation," Gabrielle said. Charlotte understood immediately. "When would you like our legal team involved?" soon Gabrielle replied, but not publicly. Charlotte nodded even though Gabrielle could not see her. I'll speak with Jonathan Blake. The name belonged to one of New York's most respected corporate attorneys. Donovan and Pierce had retained him for years on complex financial matters. He's discreet, Charlotte continued. I know, Gabrielle said. A short silence passed between them. Finally, Charlotte asked the question that had been waiting beneath everything else. Gabrielle, are you all right? Gabrielle looked down at her legs, still unmoving beneath the hospital blanket. No, she said honestly. But I will be. Charlotte did not push further. Then we'll move carefully, she said. Thank you. When the call ended, Gabrielle placed the phone beside her notebook and wrote another entry. Charlotte contacted. Legal preparation beginning. Across the city, Walter Mercer walked into his brokerage office, carrying the folder that now contained Gabrielle's signed divorce documents. The office buzzed with the familiar energy of salespeople, juggling phone calls, emails, and client meetings. Ryan Whitaker looked up from his desk when Walter entered. Well, Ryan asked. Walter dropped the folder onto the desk. It's done. Ryan leaned back in his chair. She signed. Walter nodded. Didn't even argue. Ryan raised an eyebrow. Seriously? Walter shrugged. Honestly, it was almost too easy. Ryan studied him carefully. Easy doesn't always mean simple. Walter ignored the comment and poured himself a cup of coffee from the machine in the corner. I feel like I can finally breathe again, he said. Ryan crossed his arms. You sure about that? Walter took a long sip. Yeah. Ryan didn't answer immediately. He had known Walter long enough to recognize when confidence sounded slightly forced. But Ryan also understood something else. People rarely questioned decisions they had already made. Instead, they defended them. Walter turned back toward his desk. I've got 3 client meetings today, he said, and a potential development project coming up next month. Ryan nodded. Life moves fast. Walter allowed himself a small smile. Exactly. Neither man noticed the quiet irony of the moment. Because far away in New York, inside a sleek conference room overlooking Madison Avenue, the executive board of Donovan and Pierce had just finished listening to Charlotte Pierce's briefing. One of the directors leaned forward. You're saying Gabrielle Donovan will be returning? Charlotte nodded. Yes. Another board member frowned. When Charlotte folded her hands on the table. Soon, and her instructions. Charlotte's expression remained composed. We proceed carefully. The directors exchanged curious glances, but none of them questioned the instruction, because everyone in that room understood the same truth. Gabrielle Donovan did not act impulsively. When she moved with intention. And somewhere in Boston, sitting quietly in a hospital room, the woman Walter Mercer believed he had just left behind had already begun setting the first pieces of a much larger plan into motion. Walter Mercer believed the most difficult part of his life was behind him. The paperwork had been signed. The conversations had ended. The hospital room that once represented a future, he feared no longer felt like his responsibility. 3 weeks after Gabrielle signed the divorce documents, Walter had already begun rebuilding the rhythm of the life he preferred. Work, networking, momentum. The brokerage office on Federal Street had always been loud, but lately, Walter felt more energized inside it. Deals that once seemed overwhelming now looked like opportunities again. Without the constant weight of hospital visits and uncertain conversations, his focus returned fully to the only thing that had ever truly mattered to him. Progress. One afternoon, as he walked out of a client meeting, Ryan Whitaker caught up with him near the elevators. You seem lighter, Ryan said. Walter adjusted the cuff of his shirt. I told you things would settle down. Ryan leaned against the wall, studying him. So it's official. Walter tapped the leather folder under his arm. My lawyer filed everything yesterday. Ryan nodded slowly. And Gabrielle Walter shrugged. She'll go through rehab somewhere. The words were casual, almost distant. Ryan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched the elevator numbers descend. "You ever think about visiting?" Ryan asked finally. Walter frowned slightly. "For what?" Ryan gestured vaguely. "I don't know. Closure." Walter shook his head. "That chapter's over." The elevator doors opened. Ryan stepped inside but paused before pressing the button. "You sure about that?" Walter smiled faintly. "Absolutely." The doors slid shut. Ryan watched the floor numbers change as the elevator descended. But something about the conversation lingered uneasily in his mind. A few weeks later, Walter attended another company event. This one was smaller than the investor party that had preceded the accident. But the atmosphere was similar. Polished shoes, quiet music, glasses of wine, reflecting the warm lights of the restaurant. Walter stood near the bar, speaking with two junior agents when a woman approached the group. Walter Mercer. He turned. "Yes," the woman extended her hand. "I'm Lindsay Harper. I just joined the firm last month." Walter shook her hand. Lindsay Harper had the confident posture of someone accustomed to being noticed. Her blonde hair fell neatly over one shoulder, and her voice carried an easy warmth that fit naturally into professional gatherings. "I've heard a lot about your Back Bay listings," she said. Walter smiled. "Good things, I hope." "Mostly envy," Lindsay replied with a small laugh. The conversation moved easily from there. They spoke about the Boston property market, the growing interest from international investors, and the constant competition among agents trying to secure the next major development deal. Lindsay proved to be sharp, quick to follow Walter's explanations, and quick to offer her own observations. Ryan noticed the interaction from across the room. When Walter eventually returned to the bar, Ryan leaned closer. "That didn't take long," he said quietly. Walter glanced back toward Lindsay. "What didn't?" Ryan smirked. "You moving on." Walter took a sip of his drink. "It's just a conversation." Ryan raised his glass. "Sure." But as the evening continued, Walter found himself returning to the same conversation more than once. Lindsay was curious, ambitious, and most importantly, uncomplicated. She did not ask difficult questions about hospitals or rehabilitation schedules. She asked about deals, investments, future plans, and Walter found those topics far easier to discuss. Over the next month, Walter and Lindsay began seeing each other more often. At first it was casual, coffee after work, lunch meetings that gradually lasted longer than necessary, eventually dinners. Walter told himself it was natural. Life continued. People moved forward. One evening in a quiet restaurant overlooking the Charles River, Lindsay asked the question that had been hovering quietly in the background. "So what happened with your marriage?" Walter hesitated for only a moment. "My ex-wife and I grew apart. That's the official answer," Lindsay said gently. Walter smiled. "Something like that." Lindsay waited. Walter leaned back in his chair. "There was an accident," he said. Her expression softened slightly. "That must have been difficult. It was complicated." Walter kept his explanation brief. She was injured. Recovery was going to take years. "And you decided not to stay." Walter met her eyes. "It wasn't that simple." Lindsay nodded slowly. "Life rarely is." But she did not press further. The conversation moved on. Walter appreciated that. He did not notice the small detail that might have concerned him if he had been paying closer attention. While he was describing the accident as something distant, something already resolved, Gabrielle Donovan's life had not paused in the same way. Across the city, Gabrielle had been transferred to a long-term rehabilitation center overlooking the outskirts of Boston. The building was quieter than the hospital, surrounded by tall trees that swayed gently in the autumn wind. Inside, the routine of recovery continued. Physical therapy sessions twice a day, strength training for her arms and shoulders, careful monitoring of nerve responses. Progress was slow but steady. Gabrielle still relied on the wheelchair for movement, but each day she grew stronger. And while the rehabilitation center focused on her physical recovery, another kind of work had quietly begun elsewhere. In New York, inside the Donovan and Pierce headquarters, Charlotte Pierce sat in her office, reviewing documents with a tall man seated across the desk. Jonathan Blake, corporate attorney. His reputation for discretion had made him invaluable to Donovan and Pierce for years. Blake adjusted his glasses as he studied the files Charlotte had placed in front of him. "So, Gabrielle Donovan is returning to active ownership," he said. "Yes, and she's asked you to begin preparing legal documentation." Charlotte nodded. "Correct." Blake looked through the pages carefully. "Does this involve litigation?" "Not necessarily." "Then what exactly are we preparing for?" Charlotte folded her hands calmly. "For clarity." Blake understood the word immediately. Clarity meant evidence, records, financial trails, legal positioning. "Is there a specific individual involved?" Blake asked. Charlotte considered the question. "Yes." Blake closed the folder slowly. "Then we'll proceed carefully." Back in Boston, Gabrielle sat near the window of the rehabilitation center, the familiar notebook resting on her lap. The pages had grown thick with entries, dates, names, phone conversations, financial details Charlotte had begun forwarding to her. The quiet accumulation of facts. Gabrielle wrote another entry before closing the book. Legal preparation underway. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the trees. And far across the city, Walter Mercer raised a glass in a restaurant, unaware that the quiet woman he believed he had left behind was already preparing a record of everything he had done. Autumn in Boston arrived quietly. The leaves along the Charles River turned from green to shades of gold and amber. Cool air replaced the lingering warmth of summer, and the mornings carried a faint scent of rain and fallen leaves. Inside the rehabilitation center, on the outskirts of the city, Gabrielle Donovan had begun to measure time differently. Days were no longer divided by social events or business meetings. They were divided by therapy sessions, morning rehabilitation, afternoon strength training, evening rest. Recovery demanded patience. And patience, Gabrielle had always believed, revealed the truth of things. 3 months had passed since the night of the accident. Gabrielle still relied on the wheelchair to move through the long hallways of the center, but the physical therapists had noticed something encouraging. Her upper body strength had improved significantly. And more importantly, there were faint signs of nerve response in her legs. It was not yet movement, but it was progress. That morning, Rebecca Lawson, the same therapist who had first worked with Gabrielle in the hospital, adjusted the harness system attached to a rehabilitation treadmill. "We're going to try partial weight support today," Rebecca said. Gabrielle nodded calmly. The machine would suspend part of her body weight while allowing her legs to attempt basic walking motions. For most patients, the first session was frustrating. For Gabrielle, it was simply another step. Rebecca secured the harness. "Ready?" "Yes." The treadmill began moving slowly. Gabrielle gripped the support bars as the machine guided her legs forward. Left, right, left. The motion was mechanical, assisted by the harness, but the effort still required intense concentration. Every muscle strained to respond. After 10 minutes, sweat formed along her forehead. Rebecca slowed the machine. "That's enough for today." Gabrielle exhaled slowly as the harness lifted her slightly off the moving belt. "Good progress," Rebecca added. Gabrielle gave a small nod. Later that afternoon, she returned to her room and opened the notebook that had grown thicker with each passing week. October 14th, partial weight treadmill trial. Below the entry, she added a second line. Physical progress, slow but present. Then she turned to the next page. This page held different information. Not medical, Financial. The numbers had arrived that morning through a secure email forwarded by Charlotte Pierce. Gabrielle studied the printed statements carefully. Bank account summaries, transaction histories, dates, amounts. Charlotte's message had been brief. Our legal team began reviewing the financial records connected to the divorce proceedings. We noticed several irregular withdrawals from the joint account before the documents were filed. Gabrielle traced one line of numbers with her finger. 3 weeks before the divorce papers were signed. $48,000 transferred. Another transaction followed. $32,000. Then another. The pattern was obvious. Walter Mercer had quietly withdrawn money from the shared account before formally ending the marriage. Gabrielle wrote down each amount carefully. Not because the money mattered, but because accuracy mattered. An hour later, her phone rang. Jonathan Blake. Gabrielle answered. "Good afternoon, Mr. Blake." "Ms. Donovan," he replied in a calm voice. "I hope I'm not interrupting your recovery schedule." "You're not. I've been reviewing the financial documentation Charlotte forwarded." "Yes." Blake paused briefly. "There are several withdrawals from your joint account that occurred before the divorce was finalized. I saw those. Were you aware of them at the time?" "Number." Blake made a note. "That may be relevant." Gabrielle waited. "In cases involving asset division," Blake continued, "financial transparency becomes very important." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that if one party attempted to remove shared funds before the legal separation was finalized, it can raise questions." Gabrielle closed the notebook. "What would you need to verify that bank records? I can provide them." "Good." Blake hesitated before asking the next question. "May I ask something more direct, Ms. Donovan?" "Yes. Are you pursuing legal action against Mr. Mercer?" Gabrielle looked out the window at the quiet trees beyond the rehabilitation center. "No." Blake seemed slightly surprised. "Then why gather the evidence?" Gabrielle answered simply. "Because accuracy matters." Blake was silent for a moment. "Understood," he said finally. "Continue documenting everything." When the call ended, Gabrielle opened the notebook again. She wrote another entry. Conversation with Jonathan Blake. Financial records under review. Across the city, Walter Mercer sat in his office, reviewing property listings, when Ryan Whitaker knocked lightly on the doorframe. "You busy?" Walter leaned back in his chair. "Always." Ryan stepped inside and closed the door. "You remember the joint account you had with Gabrielle?" Walter frowned. "What about it?" Ryan shrugged. "Accounting asked about a few transfers." Walter's expression tightened slightly. "Why, something about finalizing paperwork." Walter waved the concern away. "That account's closed now." Ryan nodded slowly. "Yeah, I figured." Walter looked at him. "Why do you care?" Ryan leaned against the desk. "I don't. Just thought it was interesting timing." Walter crossed his arms. "What timing?" Ryan gave a small shrug. "You moved a lot of money right before the divorce." Walter's voice sharpened slightly. "It was my money too. I didn't say it wasn't." Ryan studied him carefully. "But sometimes the way things look matters." Walter stood up. "Everything was legal." Ryan nodded. "All right." He moved toward the door, but paused before leaving. "You ever think she might check those records?" Walter laughed quietly. "Gabrielle?" "Yeah." Walter shook his head. "She never cared about money." Ryan said nothing. He simply nodded once and left the office. Walter sat back down at his desk. For a moment, a faint uneasiness flickered through his thoughts, but he dismissed it quickly. Because as far as he knew, Gabrielle Donovan was still in a rehabilitation center, focused on learning how to walk again. What Walter Mercer did not realize was that while she practiced those first fragile steps, she had also begun documenting every step he had taken away from her. And somewhere in a secure legal office in Manhattan, Jonathan Blake had already begun compiling the evidence. Winter arrived early in Boston that year. By late November, frost clung to the bare branches outside the rehabilitation center, and the mornings carried a sharp cold that crept through even the thickest coats. The world beyond the tall windows looked quieter now, softened by thin layers of snow that settled across rooftops and sidewalks. Inside the rehabilitation center, Gabrielle Donovan had begun to notice a different kind of change. Her body was responding, not dramatically, not quickly, but undeniably. Every morning she worked with Rebecca Lawson in the therapy wing, repeating the same sequence of exercises that had once felt impossible. Balance training, strength conditioning, guided walking. At first, the movements required full support from the harness system attached to the rehabilitation treadmill. Now the machine provided less assistance. The first time Gabrielle's left leg responded on its own, the motion had been so slight that Rebecca almost missed it. But Gabrielle noticed. She noticed everything. That morning, as the treadmill hummed quietly beneath her feet, Rebecca stood beside her with cautious encouragement. "Try shifting your weight forward," Rebecca said. Gabrielle gripped the support bars. Her breathing slowed as she concentrated on the simple instruction. Forward. A small tremor passed through her left leg. Then, almost imperceptibly, her foot moved. It was not a full step, but it was voluntary. Rebecca smiled. "That's it," she said softly. "Your body remembers." Gabrielle did not smile, but she nodded once. Progress did not require celebration. It required consistency. After the session ended, Gabrielle returned to her room and opened the notebook. November 23rd. Left leg voluntary response during treadmill exercise. She paused before writing the next line. Movement, minimal but confirmed. The entry was followed by several pages of notes unrelated to her physical recovery. Business reports, financial updates, correspondence from Charlotte Pierce. Over the past several weeks, Gabrielle had gradually resumed her involvement in Donovan and Pierce's operations. Not publicly, not yet, but privately through secure video calls and confidential reports. She had begun reviewing the company's structure again. Charlotte's voice came through clearly during their weekly call later that afternoon. "The board has stabilized the European supply chain," Charlotte explained from her office in Manhattan. "But the new Hong Kong distributor still requires approval from the majority shareholder." Gabrielle listened carefully. "Send me the contract terms," she said. "I already did." Gabrielle turned a page in the printed report beside her. "I'll review them tonight." Charlotte hesitated slightly. "You don't have to rush back into everything." "I'm not rushing. You're still recovering." Gabrielle looked down at the faint marks where her legs rested beneath the blanket. "Recovery doesn't require absence." Charlotte smiled faintly on the screen. "That sounds exactly like your father." Gabrielle did not respond. Arthur Donovan had believed that leadership required constant attention, even when circumstances forced distance. He used to say that a business never stopped moving simply because its owner stepped away. Someone always filled the space, and Gabrielle had spent the last 3 months ensuring that the space remained carefully controlled. Charlotte continued speaking. "There's one more issue." "What is it?" "The Boston real estate search." Gabrielle looked up slightly. "Explain. We've been considering opening a new design studio in Boston," Charlotte said, "closer to several of our American clients." Gabrielle turned to another page in the report. "Yes, I remember discussing that before the accident. We've identified several properties." And Charlotte paused. "One of the agencies representing those properties is Mercer and Lang Realty." The name lingered in the air. Walter Mercer's brokerage. Gabrielle's expression did not change. "Is Walter involved in the negotiations?" "Possibly," Charlotte said carefully. "He's one of their senior agents." Gabrielle closed the folder slowly. "Send me the full property proposals." Charlotte studied her through the screen. "Gabrielle." "Yes. "Do you want to proceed with the Boston office?" Gabrielle answered without hesitation. "Yes." Charlotte nodded slowly. "Understood." When the call ended, Gabrielle remained still for several minutes. Then she opened the notebook again. Boston Studio Proposal Agency Mercer and Lang Realty. She underlined the name once, not in anger, simply in recognition. Across Boston, Walter Mercer was unaware of the conversation taking place several miles away. He sat in a modern conference room, inside the Mercer and Lang office building, reviewing property listings with two developers from Chicago. The conversation flowed easily. Walter had always been comfortable in rooms like this. Negotiations, numbers, opportunities. The uncertainty that had clouded the months following the accident had faded from his life. His relationship with Lindsay Harper had grown steady. They attended networking events together, and several colleagues had begun referring to them as a couple. Walter's career also seemed to be gaining momentum again. A major development project near Back Bay had recently come onto the market, and Mercer and Lang had secured the listing. It was the kind of property deal that could elevate Walter's reputation within the firm. As the meeting ended, Ryan Whitaker entered the room, holding a folder. "You might want to see this," Ryan said. Walter glanced at the papers. "What is it?" New client inquiry. Walter opened the folder. Inside were documents outlining a commercial property search request. Luxury brand. International presence. Interested in establishing a new Boston headquarters. Walter scanned the page quickly. "What's the company name?" he asked. Ryan leaned against the table. "Donovan and Pierce." Walter frowned slightly. "Jewelry company." "Yeah, big one." Walter shrugged. "Never heard of them." Ryan gave a small laugh. "You don't follow luxury markets much." Walter flipped through the documents. "Well, if they're serious buyers, that's a big deal." Ryan nodded. "Exactly." Walter closed the folder with renewed interest. "Set up the meeting." Ryan smiled slightly. "I already did." Walter looked up. When Ryan checked his watch. "Next week." Walter nodded. "Perfect." Neither of them realized that the woman who controlled Donovan and Pierce had already reviewed the same proposal hours earlier, and that when the meeting finally took place, Walter Mercer would walk into a room where the balance of power had already shifted beyond his understanding. By early December, Boston carried the quiet heaviness of winter. Snow had begun settling permanently along the sidewalks and rooftops, muting the sounds of the city. The Charles River moved slowly beneath thin sheets of ice, and the cold wind that swept through downtown streets forced pedestrians to walk with their shoulders hunched and their heads lowered. Inside the Mercer and Lang Realty office, however, the atmosphere was anything but quiet. Walter Mercer stood near the large glass window overlooking Federal Street, holding the folder that Ryan Whitaker had handed him earlier that morning. The Donovan and Pierce proposal. He had read the documents twice already. Luxury jewelry brand. International clientele. Plans for a flagship design studio in Boston. The budget listed on the proposal made Walter's attention sharpen immediately. A project of that size could mean millions in real estate commissions. And commissions meant recognition. "Still staring at it," Ryan said as he walked into the office. Walter closed the folder. "You ever heard of Donovan and Pierce before?" This Ryan shrugged. "Only vaguely. They're one of those luxury brands that wealthy collectors talk about." Walter leaned against the desk. "They're looking for something big." Ryan nodded. "Which is why the firm wants you handling the meeting." Walter looked up. "Me? You're the most experienced commercial agent we've got on this project," Ryan said. "Plus, you've handled international investors before." Walter felt the familiar surge of professional confidence returning. "When's the meeting again?" Ryan checked his tablet. "Thursday morning. Their representatives are flying in from New York." Walter smiled slightly. "Good." Ryan studied him carefully. "You realize this could be a major account?" Walter nodded. I know. Ryan hesitated for a moment before speaking again. Just make sure you're prepared. Walter frowned slightly. What's that supposed to mean? Ryan shrugged. Luxury brands can be particular. Walter dismissed the comment with a small wave of his hand. I've handled demanding clients before. Ryan smiled faintly. I'm sure you have. Across the city, Gabrielle Donovan sat in a quiet conference room inside the rehabilitation center, her laptop open in front of her. The room had been arranged temporarily for her use during scheduled calls with Donovan and Pierce's executive team. A long table stood near the window and a large screen displayed the faces of several board members, dialing in remotely from New York and London. Charlotte Pierce sat at the head of the Manhattan conference table. Good afternoon, everyone, Charlotte said. The board members nodded politely as Gabrielle appeared on the screen. Although Gabrielle was still seated in her wheelchair, the calm authority in her posture was unmistakable. For many of the executives, this was the first time they had spoken with her, directly since before the accident. Charlotte began the meeting. As you know, we've been evaluating several potential locations for a new design studio in Boston. One of the directors leaned forward. Why Boston specifically? Gabrielle answered. Several of our private clients are based there. It also places us closer to our North American gemstone suppliers. The director nodded. That makes sense, Charlotte continued. We've identified 3 properties that meet our architectural and security requirements. Each property is currently represented by Mercer and Lang Realty. Another director glanced at the proposal. Is that the firm we'll be meeting this week? Yes, Charlotte said. Gabrielle spoke again. I will attend the meeting. Several board members exchanged surprised glances. Charlotte looked at her carefully. You're sure? Yes. Travel will be difficult. I won't be traveling, Gabrielle said calmly. She turned the laptop slightly so the camera revealed the quiet conference room around her. We'll conduct the meeting here. The board members nodded. That solution made sense. Charlotte closed the proposal folder. Then Thursday morning it is. 2 days later, Walter Mercer arrived early at the Mercer and Lang conference room. The space had been carefully prepared. Glass water pitchers lined the table. Property presentations were displayed on the large screen. Walter adjusted his tie as Ryan entered behind him. You look nervous, Ryan said. I'm not nervous. You've been checking that presentation for 20 minutes. Walter straightened the stack of documents. I want everything perfect. Ryan walked around the table and sat down. Relax, he said. It's just a client meeting. Walter exhaled slowly. It's not just a client meeting. Ryan smiled slightly. That's the spirit. A few minutes later, the conference room phone rang. Ryan answered. This is Mercer and Lang. Charlotte Pierce's voice came through the speaker. This is Charlotte Pierce from Donovan and Pierce. We're ready to begin the conference call. Ryan pressed a button. The large screen flickered to life. Several executives appeared in small windows across the display. Charlotte Pierce sat at the center. Walter immediately shifted into his professional posture. Good morning, Ms. Pierce, he said confidently. Good morning, Mr. Mercer, Charlotte replied. Walter began the presentation. For the Boston studio project, we've identified 3 prime locations that offer both architectural flexibility and strong long-term value. He spoke smoothly, moving through the slides with practiced ease. Ryan watched from the side of the room. Walter was at his best in situations like this. Confident, persuasive, exactly the kind of agent high-profile clients expected. But halfway through the presentation, Charlotte raised a hand slightly. Mr. Mercer, she said. Yes, there's someone else who will be joining this meeting shortly. Walter nodded politely. Of course. Charlotte glanced briefly to her left. The camera angle shifted slightly. A door opened off-screen. And then another figure moved into view. For a moment, Walter did not recognize her. The lighting was different, the setting unfamiliar. But then the camera focused, and Walter Mercer felt the air leave his lungs. Gabrielle Donovan sat calmly in a wheelchair at the far end of the Manhattan conference table. Her posture was composed, her expression unreadable. Charlotte turned toward the camera. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I'd like to introduce you to the majority owner and executive director of Donovan and Pierce." She paused. "This is Gabrielle Donovan." The conference room inside Mercer and Lang fell completely silent. Walter stared at the screen. His mind struggled to connect the image in front of him with the memory he carried from months earlier. The hospital room, the wheelchair, the divorce papers. Ryan looked slowly from the screen to Walter. Walter's voice finally returned, though it sounded unfamiliar even to him. Gabrielle's eyes met his through the screen. Calm, steady, professional. "Good morning, Walter," she said. And in that moment, Walter Mercer realized that the story he believed had ended months ago had only just begun. For several seconds after Gabrielle Donovan appeared on the screen, no one in the Mercer and Lang conference room moved. Walter Mercer stood frozen beside the presentation monitor, the remote still in his hand. The polished slides behind him, maps, building schematics, financial projections, suddenly felt irrelevant. Across the screen, the boardroom in Manhattan remained composed. Charlotte Pierce sat calmly at the head of the table. Several Donovan and Pierce executives watched with quiet attention. No one spoke. The silence stretched just long enough for Walter to realize something uncomfortable. Everyone in that room already knew who Gabrielle was, except him. Ryan Whitaker shifted slightly in his chair, glancing at Walter, before looking back toward the screen. Walter finally found his voice. "Gabrielle, I didn't realize you were involved in this project." His words sounded careful, professional, but beneath them confusion lingered. Gabrielle met his gaze through the screen. Her expression remained neutral. "I am." Walter forced a small nod, attempting to regain control of the moment. "Well, it's good to see you." There was no hostility in her face, but there was no warmth either. Just quiet observation. Charlotte Pierce broke the silence. "Mr. Mercer, please continue your presentation." Walter turned back toward the screen, displaying the property slides. For the first time since he began the meeting, his concentration faltered. He clicked to the next slide. "The second location we're proposing is a renovated building near Newbury Street," he said. "It offers approximately 20,000 square feet of interior space with potential for private showroom areas." His voice sounded slightly tighter than before. Gabrielle listened without interrupting. Charlotte occasionally asked technical questions about zoning restrictions and structural capacity. Walter answered them as best he could, but part of his attention remained fixed on the quiet figure seated in the Manhattan conference room. Gabrielle Donovan, majority owner of Donovan and Pierce. The words repeated in his mind with increasing weight. After 15 minutes, Walter finished the final slide. "These 3 locations represent the strongest options currently available in Boston's luxury commercial district," he concluded. Charlotte nodded. "Thank you." She turned slightly toward Gabrielle. "Would you like to review the proposals?" Gabrielle glanced down at the documents in front of her. "Yes." She spoke calmly, but every word carried deliberate clarity. "The Newbury Street location is architecturally interesting," she said, "but the security infrastructure would require significant upgrades." Walter blinked slightly. That observation was correct. He hadn't mentioned it in the presentation. Charlotte nodded. "Our security consultants reached the same conclusion." Gabrielle turned another page. "The Back Bay property offers better structural control. However, The building's renovation timeline appears optimistic. Walter felt Ryan glance toward him. Gabrielle continued speaking. According to the permits filed with the city last month, the construction schedule may extend 6 months beyond the developer's estimate. Walter's pulse quickened. That information had not been part of the materials Mercer and Lang received. "How did you?" he began, before stopping himself. Gabrielle looked up. "We reviewed the city's permit records." Walter nodded slowly. "Of course. Large corporations conducted deeper research than brokerage firms." Still, the realization unsettled him. Gabrielle returned to the final proposal. "The third property," she said, "has the most potential." Charlotte leaned slightly forward. "You agree?" "Yes." Walter felt a brief surge of relief. At least the meeting was moving forward. Gabrielle continued calmly. "But before we discuss the property further, there is another matter I would like to clarify." Charlotte did not react with surprise. Ryan noticed that immediately. Walter frowned slightly. "What matter?" he asked. Gabrielle opened a thin folder beside her. Inside were several printed documents, bank statements, transaction records. Walter's stomach tightened slightly as he recognized the formatting. Gabrielle spoke evenly. "During the divorce process earlier this year, several financial transfers occurred from the joint account shared by Walter Mercer and myself." Ryan slowly sat upright in his chair. Walter's voice sharpened. "This isn't relevant to the meeting." Gabrielle did not look at him directly. "It is relevant to clarity." Charlotte remained silent, allowing the conversation to unfold. Gabrielle continued. 3 withdrawals occurred in the weeks prior to the divorce filing. She read the amounts calmly. $48,000, $32,000, and an additional transfer totaling $19,000. Walter felt the room closing in slightly. "That money belonged to both of us," he said quickly. Gabrielle nodded. "Yes." Her voice remained neutral, but the transfers were executed without notification during an active marriage. Walter opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, another voice entered the conversation. Jonathan Blake. The corporate attorney sat quietly at the far end of the Donovan and Pierce table. Mr. Mercer Blake said calmly, "We're not accusing you of wrongdoing." Walter looked at the screen. "Then why bring this up now?" Blake folded his hands. "Because documentation matters." Ryan glanced sideways at Walter. Gabrielle closed the folder gently. "I kept records," she said. Walter's mind flashed back to the hospital room, the notebook, the quiet way she had written everything down. Gabrielle continued speaking. "I also recorded the conversations that occurred during my hospitalization." Walter's heart skipped. "What conversations?" Gabrielle looked at him for the first time since the meeting began. "The ones where you explained that caring for me was not a future you were willing to accept." Ryan exhaled slowly. Walter's voice rose slightly. "This has nothing to do with a real estate deal." Gabrielle nodded. "You're correct." She folded her hands calmly on the table. "It has nothing to do with real estate." The room fell silent again. Then Gabrielle spoke the final sentence in the same quiet tone she had used throughout the meeting. "But it does explain why I'm here today." Walter stared at the screen. For the first time since the accident, the balance of the conversation had completely shifted, and the quiet woman he once believed powerless was now controlling every word spoken in the room. The silence that followed Gabrielle Donovan's last sentence felt heavier than anything that had been said during the entire meeting. Inside the Mercer and Lang conference room, no one moved. Walter Mercer stood beside the presentation screen, his shoulders rigid. The stack of polished property proposals suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the thin folder Gabrielle had placed on the table in Manhattan. Ryan Whitaker slowly leaned back in his chair. He had expected the meeting to be tense once Gabrielle appeared. He had not expected this. Across the screen, the Donovan and Pierce boardroom remained composed. The executives seated beside Charlotte Pierce did not look surprised. Their expressions suggested they had already seen the documents Gabrielle referenced. Jonathan Blake adjusted his glasses and spoke again, his tone measured and professional. "Mr. Mercer, we are not conducting a legal proceeding here." Walter looked directly at the screen. "Then what exactly is this?" Blake replied calmly. "This is clarification." Walter let out a short breath that sounded more like frustration than relief. "You're bringing up private financial matters in a business meeting." Gabrielle spoke before Blake could respond. They became relevant when the same individual representing the property transaction was also involved in the circumstances that created those financial records. Walter shook his head. "That's a stretch." Gabrielle did not react to the challenge. Instead, she opened the folder again. Inside were several documents arranged in careful order. "March 12th, she said quietly. She slid one page forward so it was visible to the camera. "A transfer of $48,000 from our joint account." Another page followed. "March 18th, $32,000. A third, March 25th, $19,000. Walter crossed his arms. "You've already said that." Gabrielle nodded. "Yes." She turned another page. "And here are the corresponding account statements." The numbers matched exactly. Ryan glanced at Walter again. Walter's jaw tightened slightly. "That money belonged to both of us." Gabrielle did not disagree. "But you withdrew it without notifying me during my hospitalization." Walter's voice sharpened. "You were unconscious for half that time. I was not unconscious on March 18th. Walter opened his mouth to respond, but no words followed. Jonathan Blake spoke quietly. "Again, we are not accusing Mr. Mercer of a criminal act." Walter looked at him. "Then why does this feel like an interrogation?" Blake folded his hands. "Because documentation often feels uncomfortable when it appears unexpectedly." Walter exhaled through his nose. "This conversation is inappropriate." Charlotte Pierce spoke for the first time since Gabrielle began presenting the records. "Mr. Mercer, Donovan, and Pierce values transparency in every business relationship." Walter turned slightly toward the screen, displaying Charlotte. "This isn't a business relationship." Charlotte's voice remained calm. "Your firm requested the opportunity to represent our company in the acquisition of a new Boston property." "That's correct, and part of our responsibility is understanding the individuals we may be working with." Walter gave a short, humorless laugh. "So you investigated my personal life." Charlotte's expression did not change. "We reviewed publicly accessible financial records connected to the legal proceedings that involved one of our executives." Ryan slowly straightened in his chair. Walter glanced at him briefly. Then he turned back to the screen. "This is ridiculous." Gabrielle closed the folder. "I agree." Walter blinked slightly. "You do?" "Yes." Her tone remained steady. "Because the money itself was never important." Walter frowned. "Then what is?" Gabrielle answered simply. "Accuracy." The words settled into the room, quietly. Walter's frustration grew sharper. "You signed the divorce papers," he said. "Yes." "You didn't object to the transfers." "I wasn't aware of them." Walter ran a hand across his forehead. "This has nothing to do with the property deal." Gabrielle met his gaze through the screen. "No," she said, "it doesn't." Another pause followed. Then she added calmly, "But the way you explained your decision that day is relevant." Walter felt Ryan shift again beside him. "What decision?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Gabrielle's voice remained composed. "The moment you decided that caring for your injured wife was not a future you were willing to accept." Walter's expression hardened. That was a personal decision. Yes, and it had nothing to do with money. Gabrielle nodded. I know. Walter frowned. Then why bring it up? Gabrielle leaned slightly forward in her wheelchair. Because you made that decision, believing something that was not true. Walter stared at the screen. What do you mean? Gabrielle spoke quietly. You believed you were leaving a burden. Walter felt the air in the room shift again. That's not what I said. Gabrielle did not argue. Instead, she reached for another document. This one was different. It was not a bank statement. It was a printed legal summary, the Donovan and Pierce ownership structure. She turned the page toward the camera. Donovan and Pierce has been privately held since its founding. Ryan leaned closer to the screen. Charlotte remained silent. Gabrielle continued. My father transferred controlling ownership to me 3 years ago. Walter's confusion deepened. What does that have to do with? He stopped, because suddenly the pieces began connecting in his mind. The quiet studio in their house, the jewelry sketches, the frequent shipments that arrived without explanation. Gabrielle finished the sentence he had not been able to complete. The company you're presenting to today. Walter's throat tightened. I own it. The room went completely still. Ryan's eyes widened slightly. Walter's mind struggled to process the statement. That's not possible. Gabrielle's expression remained unchanged. Donovan and Pierce is currently valued at approximately $500 million. Walter felt the weight of those words settle into the room. 500 million. Ryan slowly turned his head toward him. Walter spoke again, but his voice sounded distant even to himself. You're saying you owned this company the entire time? Yes. Walter's memory replayed the hospital room, the divorce papers, the sentence he had spoken without hesitation. I didn't sign up to be a caretaker. Gabrielle closed the folder. I never mentioned it because I wanted to live a normal life. Walter stared at her. And you let me believe you were just designing jewelry from home? Yes. The quiet honesty of the answer made the room feel smaller. Walter's hands tightened at his sides. You could have told me. Gabrielle met his eyes. You never asked. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, Charlotte Pierce broke the silence. Mr. Mercer, thank you for presenting the property options. Walter barely heard the words. Charlotte continued calmly. However, Donovan and Pierce will be pursuing the Boston property acquisition through a different agency. Walter looked up slowly. Ryan closed his eyes briefly. The meaning was unmistakable. The deal was gone. Walter's voice came out quieter now. So this meeting was never about the property. Gabrielle answered gently. No. She paused before finishing the thought. It was about clarity. For several seconds after Gabrielle spoke the word clarity, the conference room at Mercer and Lang remained completely still. Walter Mercer no longer looked at the presentation screen. He looked only at Gabrielle, the woman who had once sat silently in a hospital bed, now sat calmly at the head of a conference table in Manhattan, surrounded by executives who treated her with unmistakable respect. $500 million. The number echoed in his mind with increasing weight. Across the table, Ryan Whitaker slowly exhaled. He had known Walter for nearly a decade, and in that entire time he had never seen his friend look this unprepared. Walter finally spoke. So you set this up? Gabrielle tilted her head slightly. No. You knew I'd be the one handling the property. I didn't know. Walter's jaw tightened. But when you saw the name. Yes, Gabrielle said. The honesty in her answer was quiet but direct. Walter turned slightly away from the screen, pacing once across the conference room floor, before turning back. You could have called me, he said. The words sounded less angry than confused. You could have told me who you were." Gabrielle did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked down briefly at the notebook resting beside her folder, the same notebook she had carried since the hospital. Then she looked up again. "I thought you understood who I was." Walter shook his head. "No, I didn't." Gabrielle nodded. "That's true." The statement was neither cruel nor sympathetic. It was simply factual. Ryan leaned forward slightly in his chair. The tension in the room was becoming almost physical. Walter spoke again. "You let me walk away." "Yes." "You didn't say a word." "No." Walter gave a short, frustrated laugh. Why, Gabrielle considered the question carefully before answering. "Because you had already made your decision." Walter ran a hand through his hair. "You're saying this is all my fault?" Gabrielle shook her head slowly. "No." Walter looked at her sharply. "No, no." Her voice remained steady. "This is simply the result of choices." Walter's shoulders stiffened. "You're enjoying this." The accusation hung in the air, but Gabrielle's expression did not change. "No," she said quietly. Walter waited. Then he spoke again. "You lost the ability to walk." "Yes, and I didn't stay." "That's correct." Walter's voice rose slightly. "Most people would call that betrayal." Gabrielle studied him for a moment. "Some would." "And you don't?" Gabrielle's answer came without hesitation. "I call it honesty." Walter frowned. "What does that mean?" Gabrielle folded her hands calmly. "It means you told the truth about who you were." The words landed softly but firmly. Walter had no immediate response. Across the table, Ryan watched the exchange with growing unease. Because he could see something Walter could not yet see. Gabrielle was not angry. She was finished. Charlotte Pierce spoke gently. "Mr. Mercer, Donovan and Pierce appreciates the time you spent preparing the property proposals." Walter barely reacted. Charlotte continued. "But as I mentioned earlier, we'll be working with another agency moving forward." Walter's eyes flickered briefly toward Ryan. Ryan already understood the implication. The commission from the Donovan and Pierce deal would likely have been the largest Walter had ever handled. Now it was gone. Walter's voice sounded hollow. "So that's it?" Charlotte nodded. "Yes." Walter laughed quietly. "This whole thing was just closure for you." Gabrielle shook her head again. "No." Walter looked at her. "No. No." She paused for a moment before continuing. "It was never about closure." Walter waited. Gabrielle spoke the final sentence calmly. "It was about accuracy." Walter exhaled slowly. "You keep using that word." "Yes." Why, Gabrielle looked at him steadily. "Because stories change over time." Walter frowned. "What stories? The ones we tell ourselves." Ryan shifted slightly in his chair. Gabrielle continued. "You told people that you left a difficult marriage." Walter did not deny it. "You told them your wife couldn't handle life." Walter's face tightened. "That's not exactly what I said." Gabrielle opened the notebook. She turned a few pages. "I wrote it down." Walter stared at the notebook. "You recorded everything, yes." Ryan's eyebrows lifted slightly. Gabrielle continued calmly. "The phone call with Ryan in the bar." Ryan straightened in his chair. "The conversation outside my hospital room." Walter looked suddenly uneasy. "You recorded that too?" "No," Gabrielle said. "I wrote it down." She closed the notebook gently. "Because memory fades." Walter looked away for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "So what happens now?" Gabrielle answered simply. "Nothing." Walter blinked. "That's it." "Yes. No lawsuit. No. No public humiliation." Gabrielle shook her head. "No." Walter stared at her. "Why not?" Gabrielle leaned back slightly in her wheelchair. "Because I'm not interested in Revenge. The calm certainty in her voice filled the room. Walter slowly sat down in the chair beside the conference table. For the first time since the meeting began, he looked tired. "You could destroy my career," he said quietly. Gabrielle considered the statement. "Possibly. And you're choosing not to." "Yes." Walter studied her carefully. Why, Gabrielle looked out the window behind the Manhattan conference table. The winter sky over the city was pale and distant. Then she looked back at him. "Because you already made your choice." Walter remembered the hospital room again. The papers. The words he had spoken without hesitation. "I didn't sign up to be a caretaker." Gabrielle spoke one final time. "And now I'm making mine." She turned slightly toward Charlotte. "I think we're finished here." Charlotte nodded. "Yes." Jonathan Blake closed the folder in front of him. Ryan looked at Walter once more. Walter did not move. The video screen flickered slightly as the Donovan and Pierce conference call ended. The executives in Manhattan disappeared from view, and the Mercer and Lang conference room returned to silence. Walter remained seated for several seconds. Then he whispered quietly, to no one in particular. "I didn't know." Ryan stood slowly. "I believe you," he said. But neither of them could change what had already been done. 1 year later, the winter snow in Boston had melted into the first quiet signs of spring. The Charles River moved freely again, reflecting pale sunlight across its slow surface. Along the sidewalks near Back Bay, trees that had stood bare through the long winter now showed small green leaves returning to their branches. Life had continued moving forward. It always did. Inside a renovated exhibition hall near the Boston waterfront, the annual North American Jewelry and Design Exhibition had drawn collectors, investors, and designers from around the world. Glass display cases filled the vast room. Soft lighting reflected across polished gemstones, emeralds, diamonds, sapphires, each piece arranged with careful precision. Conversations moved quietly between guests in tailored suits and evening dresses. At the center of the exhibition, a large display carried a simple name: Donovan and Pierce. Charlotte Pierce stood beside the display table, speaking with a group of international buyers who admired a necklace set with deep blue Sri Lankan sapphires. "Every stone was cut in our Antwerp facility," Charlotte explained. "The design was finalized earlier this year." The buyers nodded appreciatively. One of them glanced toward the entrance of the exhibition hall. "Is Gabrielle Donovan attending tonight?" Charlotte smiled slightly. "She is." As if on cue, the quiet hum of the room shifted subtly. Near the entrance, Gabrielle Donovan had just arrived. She moved slowly through the exhibition hall, accompanied by one of Donovan and Pierce's assistants. The wheelchair she had relied on months earlier was no longer present. Instead, Gabrielle walked carefully with the support of a slim black cane. Her steps were measured, deliberate, but unmistakably her own. A few guests noticed her immediately. Conversations softened, not because she demanded attention, but because her presence carried a quiet gravity. Charlotte saw her approach and stepped forward. "You made it," she said warmly. Gabrielle smiled faintly. "Yes." Charlotte studied her carefully. "You're walking." Sometimes, Gabrielle replied. "That's remarkable progress." Gabrielle looked around the exhibition hall. "Everything looks beautiful." Charlotte gestured toward the display. "The sapphire piece is already drawing attention." Gabrielle stepped closer to the glass case. The necklace inside had been one of her designs. She had sketched the first concept, months earlier, while sitting near the window of the rehabilitation center, her notebook balanced on her lap. "Has the London collector confirmed interest?" Gabrielle asked. Charlotte nodded. "He's already asked about pricing." Gabrielle allowed herself a small, satisfied nod. Across the hall, guests continued moving between displays. Collectors examined gemstones through small magnifying lenses. Designers discussed craftsmanship and sourcing. Quiet deals formed in low conversations. For Gabrielle, the atmosphere felt familiar again, not because she had missed the business, but because it reminded her that life continued beyond moments of loss. Charlotte leaned slightly closer. "There's something else," she said quietly. "What Donovan and Pierce officially signed the Boston studio lease last month." Gabrielle nodded. "With the new agency?" "Yes." Charlotte hesitated briefly before adding one more detail. "Mercer and Lang Realty closed 2 offices this winter." Gabrielle's expression did not change. "I heard." Charlotte studied her. "You didn't ask why. I didn't need to." Charlotte nodded slowly. Business reputations were fragile. One failed deal rarely destroyed a career, but a series of missed opportunities could. Walter Mercer had lost the Donovan and Pierce account, and within months, several other high-profile clients had chosen different agencies. Nothing dramatic had happened. No public scandal, no accusations. Just a quiet shift in confidence. Charlotte glanced toward the entrance again. "Do you ever wonder what happened to him?" Gabrielle considered the question briefly. Then she answered calmly. "No." Charlotte smiled faintly. "That sounds like you." Gabrielle turned her attention back to the display cases. People passed by admiring the jewelry without realizing the woman who designed several pieces stood only a few feet away. And Gabrielle preferred it that way. Later that evening, after the exhibition began to wind down, Gabrielle stepped outside onto the quiet waterfront walkway. The air was cool, but gentle, compared to the harsh winter months. The city lights reflected across the harbor. Gabrielle leaned lightly on the railing, her cane resting beside her. Behind her, the exhibition hall doors opened. Charlotte stepped outside. "You disappeared," she said. "I needed some air." Charlotte joined her at the railing. For a moment, both women looked out over the water in silence. Then Charlotte spoke softly. "You know, most people would have handled that situation very differently." Gabrielle did not ask what she meant. "You had every legal reason to pursue him," Charlotte continued. "The financial withdrawals alone could have justified a case." Gabrielle nodded. "I know, but you didn't." "No." Charlotte turned slightly toward her. Why? Gabrielle watched the quiet movement of the harbor water. "Because it wouldn't change anything." Charlotte waited. Gabrielle continued. "Walter told the truth about who he was, and that was enough." "Yes." Charlotte smiled thoughtfully. "That's a rare perspective." Gabrielle picked up her cane. "Not really." Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "No." Gabrielle turned toward the entrance of the exhibition hall. "People reveal themselves when they believe no one is watching." Charlotte recognized the phrase immediately. "Your father used to say that." "Yes." Gabrielle paused briefly before finishing the thought. "And when they do, it's important to believe them." Charlotte watched her for a moment. Then she nodded. Inside the exhibition hall, the final guests were beginning to leave. The lights dimmed slightly as staff prepared to close the event for the evening. Gabrielle walked back inside, slowly, each step steady. She did not look back at the harbor. She did not look back at the past. Some stories did not require revenge. They required clarity and the quiet strength to move forward with dignity. When a story ends this quietly, the silence it leaves behind often carries more meaning than the events themselves. Gabrielle Donovan never stood on a stage to explain what happened. She never gave interviews about the accident, the divorce, or the meeting that changed the direction of Walter Mercer's career. She simply continued living, designing, leading Donovan and Pierce with the same careful patience her father once taught her. Sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal is not anger. and it is not revenge. Sometimes it is the decision to walk away slowly, deliberately, and with the quiet knowledge that the truth has already spoken for itself. Stories like Gabrielle's travel far beyond the rooms where they begin. They remind us that character often reveals itself in the moments when life becomes difficult. If this story reached you tonight, I'd be curious to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. These stories connect people across different places in ways we rarely expect. And if you believe that dignity and truth eventually find their way back into the light, you're welcome to stay with this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told.